In the early months of 1945, an entire regiment of Japanese soldiers retreated into the crocodile-infested swamps of Ramree Island off the western coast of Burma. They were never heard from again, with their punctuated screams throughout the night serving as the only evidence of the fate that befell them. It was the worst crocodile attack on humans in history. Or was it? Hello everyone, and welcome to the World Strider channel, where we cover topics related to Japan, history, and the outdoors. Now, the Battle of Ramree Island, by any measure, was only a minor engagement in the larger scheme of World War II. But the supposed crocodile attack that took place during the fighting has caused it to take on somewhat of a legendary status within the annals of the war. The Guinness Book of World Records even recognizes it as the deadliest crocodile attack in history. However, in recent years, some have questioned the claims and the story as it traditionally has been told. So here I want to take a closer look at the story and some of the sources behind it and see if we can't arrive at something closer to the truth of the matter. Before I do though, I want to apologize for filming this indoors where the sound isn't exactly perfect. I like to film things out in nature and actually have something beautiful behind me while I speak, but it is absolutely freezing here in Japan and I really don't think I could sit out there for very long. Also, the wind is pretty brutal and I think that actually has a worse effect on the sound. So please bear with me as I tell the story here with this beautiful National Geographic map of Asia behind me. Okay, so let's begin with the story. Back in 1942, the Japanese military had swept through Southeast Asia, defeating every army in their path. At this time, most of the region was still ruled by the various European colonial powers, all of whom were quickly overwhelmed. The British were one such power in the area, with their main colonies being Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, all of which quickly fell in the face of the Japanese onslaught. The Japanese retained control of these areas for several years, but eventually the tide of war turned against them, and the British and Americans were able to start regaining lost ground. By early 1945, the situation had become all but hopeless for the Japanese, but refusing to give up, they remained entrenched in several key areas, including most of Burma. This brings us to the battle itself. Without going into too much detail, the 26th Indian Infantry Division and elements of the British Royal Marines were tasked with retaking several strategically important Burmese islands from the Japanese, one of them being Ramree Island. There, the British and Indian troops encountered heavy resistance, but eventually a large force of Japanese soldiers, roughly 900 in total, decided their best option was to retreat across the island to link up with a larger Japanese battalion stationed there. Unfortunately for them, this meant they had to cross 16 kilometers of mangrove swamps and thick forests. The going was so slow that while the Japanese were mired in the swamps, the British force pursuing them was able to encircle the entire swampland, trapping the Japanese inside. Unfortunately for them, it turned out that they were not alone in the swamps. Let's take a moment to consider how hellish the conditions must have been for the Japanese inside those swamps at the time. They were exhausted, defeated, and wet. Mosquitoes ate them alive while they themselves starved. Tropical diseases ran rampant through their ranks. But most terrifying of all were the giant saltwater crocodiles lurking unseen beneath the surface of the water, watching and waiting for these men to slip up. The British soldiers encircling them made repeated calls for the Japanese to come out and surrender, all of which went unheeded. On the night of February 19th, the British soldiers began to hear terrible sounds ringing out from within the swamps. One of the soldiers, a man named Bruce Stanley Wright, wrote an account of that night. He says, "That night was the most horrible that any member of the ML, meaning motor launch, crews ever experienced. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred, worrying sounds of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. At dawn, the vultures arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left." Eventually, the British decided to enter the swamp to finish what remained of the Japanese force. But when they did, they found only 20 men alive. 20 out of 900. Okay, so there's the story more or less in the form that it's been told for decades. But is this really believable? Is it even plausible for crocodiles to have consumed so many men in such a short period of time? Let's pick this story apart a little bit. Let's start with the sources that we have available related to this incident. In addition to Wright's account that I mentioned before, in my research I was able to find several other sources that seem to corroborate more or less what happened. The first is an account by Lieutenant General Jack Jacob. Sounds suspicious, but I assure you, he's a real person. He took part in the battle and he wrote a memoir after the war called An Odyssey in War and Peace. In it, he says, over 1,000 soldiers of the Japanese garrison retreated into the crocodile-infested mangrove swamps. We went in with boats and interpreters, using loudhailers asking them to come out. Not a single one did. Saltwater crocodiles, some of them well over 20 feet in length, frequented those waters. It is not difficult to imagine what happened to the Japanese who took refuge in the mangroves. Okay, so the next source is from the Burma Star Association, which is apparently a veterans group made up of people, both men and women, who served in the Burma campaign. One of their accounts of the battle says this of the Japanese troops trapped within the swamps. In this mud and mangrove, they were prey to mosquitoes, flies, scorpions, and worst of all, crocodiles. And with little or no food and water, the Japs died by the hundreds. His words, not mine. Some tried to swim or fight, but they were either got by our patrols or drowned or taken by crocs. The crocs were on our side, he says. And another, this is also from the Burma Star Association, says, those numbering about 1,000 who remained in the mangroves were suffering most horribly without food or drinking water. Attacked by malarial mosquitoes, scorpions, and most dreadfully by the crocodiles attracted to them by the blood from their wounds, which were covered in blowflies. What, to the Allies, made it worse was that this total sacrifice was completely unnecessary. Okay, sounds pretty terrible, if you ask me. Interestingly, the second article from the Burma Star Association goes on to mention the Guinness Book of World Records entry about this event. Okay, so let's start by looking at what all these sources say. What's consistent between them? I think that's important to establish first and foremost. Well, they all tell pretty much the same story, more or less as far as I can tell, painting a pretty grim picture of the conditions within the swamp. They also mention in every one that at least some Japanese soldiers were eaten by crocodiles. All of the claims made so far are certainly plausible. We know there were crocodiles of the saltwater variety on Ramree Island at the time. They have a wide distribution, and it was an even wider distribution back then. We also know that saltwater crocodiles will actively and readily eat humans. Now, this isn't to say that other animals aren't known to become man-eaters from time to time. I even made a video about a man-eating bear in the north of Japan in 1915 who killed 7 people. Other animals known to hunt humans include tigers, lions, and sharks are probably some of the more well-known ones. But what these other animals, saltwater crocodiles aside, have in common is that they tend to only view humans as prey under very specific conditions and circumstances. Saltwater crocodiles, on the other hand, make no such distinctions. They don't care if you're a person or a wildebeest or whatever other animals saltwater crocodiles are known to eat. They will eat you if they can get you. I was even able to find another account by Burmese locals living on Ramree Island during the war. Now, this is about a separate event involving other Japanese soldiers and other crocodiles, but it does seem to corroborate the fact that these crocodiles in particular, the ones living on Ramree, were known man-eaters. Now, let's take a moment to consider what all of these sources fail to say, or what they don't say. And I think that's a very important study here. First of all, if you notice, none of them actually confirm how many Japanese soldiers were killed by crocodiles specifically, okay? They only mention that 900 went in and 20 survived, and that some were killed by crocodiles, but they leave this fairly vague. Personally, I think that there were a lot of assumptions made about the number of people killed by crocodiles. Also, one thing that's glaringly absent from this whole story are any accounts by surviving Japanese soldiers or Burmese locals. I mentioned that Burmese locals had talked about crocodiles killing Japanese soldiers before, but none mentioned this particular incident. Additionally, no official British military reports mention the incident either, only veterans after the fact. Finally, historian Frank McLynn cast doubt on the claims based on the sheer number of crocodiles that would have been necessary to consume so many people. Here's his take on it. He says, most of all, there's a single zoological problem. If thousands of crocodiles were involved in the massacre, as in the urban myth, you can already tell what he thinks of this story, how had these ravening monsters survived before, and how were they to survive later? The ecosystem of a mangrove swamp, with an exiguous mammal life, simply would not have permitted the existence of so many saurians before the coming of the Japanese. Animals are not exempt from the laws of overpopulation and starvation, he goes on to say. Now, say what you will about Frank McLynn as a source, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think his arguments about population are both interesting and compelling. Unfortunately, we can't say for certain how big the population of crocodiles would have been on the island at the time. And to be honest, we can't even compare it to the population on the island today, as there are no longer any crocodiles alive on the island. It no longer supports a population there. Now, back to Frank McLynn's credibility as a source. There's a couple issues with the rest of his arguments that I want to get into for a second. First of all, he claims that because the Japanese had so much firepower, they could have easily defeated these saltwater crocodiles and prevented them from attacking them. That's one of the reasons he gives for why the story is not really plausible. Now, in my opinion, this is not a very compelling argument. Sure, the Japanese had guns, they had rifles that could easily have dispatched crocodiles, but does Frank even think about how crocodiles attack, their MO, okay? Crocodiles usually lurk beneath the surface, as I mentioned earlier. They're opportunistic hunters, they wait, they attack when the moment is right, and they attack quickly and rapidly, way faster than I think would be possible for any human to react under the circumstances. Remember, they were tired, they were exhausted, they were sick, and it was at night, as is claimed by most of these first-hand accounts. So to think that just because they had guns, they could have defeated these crocodiles or warded off these crocodile attacks, I think is a bit simplistic. There are also some unfounded claims within McLynn's arguments that I want to talk about as well. The biggest one being that he questions the existence of the aforementioned Wright. Remember Bruce Stanley Wright, the man who wrote the first account of the crocodile attack. He was a soldier who was stationed there. It was a first-hand account. And by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but he was actually a naturalist. So he's somewhat qualified to talk about crocodiles and crocodile attacks. Now, Frank McLynn, questions that this man ever existed, making dubious claims like there's no record of him or something like that, or he was made up in order to perpetuate this urban myth. But there are actually several other accounts verifying Wright's existence. He's mentioned in a couple of other sources. I believe he was Canadian as well, so there are some sources in Canada and other places that mention him too. So there's no real basis for this claim on McLynn's part. So that was just to give you kind of a fair assessment of what McLynn says, but I do think he makes a good point about the population of crocodiles probably not being sufficient to have killed 900 people. And finally, I think it's worth considering the evidence that the British soldiers would have seen upon entering the mangrove swamp. Now, all of them mention kind of suspiciously that there were only 20 men left alive. Now, there's some mention of vultures cleaning up what the crocodiles hadn't eaten, but they don't really mention a whole lot of detail about what the dead bodies were like. Like, did they see any dead bodies? Were there bits of dead bodies? Were there no dead bodies? Were there just 20 men sitting there tired and, hungry? Or was there anything else there? I'd like to know more about that. Now, there not being a lot of bodies makes sense because generally crocodiles, when possible, will eat their prey whole, or at least they'll consume all parts of it unless, it gets away or something like that. So that is plausible, but it does seem interesting to me that there's no mention of that at all. Now, you may not find that to be the most compelling argument on my part, but what I think at least it does tell us is that the men had no real way of proving or at least we don't see that in the sources, that it was in fact crocodiles that killed those men. Because if there weren't any bodies around, they could have escaped. They could have gotten away somehow, broken through the encirclement. They could have been eaten by crocodiles, but we don't really know. They could have been left in other parts of the swamp, or they could be anywhere really. So just another one of those things that I think makes it difficult to say for certain what happened. So to wrap everything up, what most likely happened at the Battle of Ramree Island? I think it is pretty safe to say that some soldiers were eaten by crocodiles. The evidence seems to support this. There were screams in the night. They heard the sounds of crocodiles. Ominously, they were able to hear the whirring of them. They knew there were crocodiles in those swamps. We have sources from earlier in the war verifying and confirming that those crocodiles were known man-eaters. We know crocodiles' behavior. We know that they will eat things that are near the water's edge. They're opportunistic surprise hunters, okay? So these are all things that lead me at least to believe that yes, some people were killed by crocodiles, possibly even a lot were killed by crocodiles. But what I don't believe is that anywhere near 900 or the 880 or so soldiers that they claim were eaten were actually all killed by crocodiles. I just don't think the numbers really add up. We'll never know with any certainty how many exactly were killed. So it's really hard to say. I think it's a bit disingenuous for Guinness to say that it was the deadliest crocodile attack on humans because we just really don't know what the numbers are. I'm in no way trying to say that this wasn't a horrific situation, that it's not an interesting story, because it's interesting as hell. Surely a lot of these men were killed by crocodiles, tired, dejected, diseased men, hiding in a mangrove forest, refusing to give up, being surprised by these crocodiles coming out of the water. It must have made for a crazy situation, and I think it deserves all of the notoriety that it has gotten as a story, absolutely. But I just don't think that we can say that 900 soldiers were completely wiped out by crocodiles. So what did happen to these remaining soldiers? Well, in a couple of the sources, the Burma Star Association being one of them, there seems to be kind of some ambiguity or some disagreement about the numbers of soldiers that went in, because the Burma Star Association also mentions that 500 soldiers were able to escape, Japanese soldiers, from the Battle of Ramree Island. But it's not clear about where these soldiers came from. Were they the same soldiers that went into the mangrove swamp? Were they a separate group of soldiers? So it's possible that a lot of them just simply escaped, or they died along the way and their bodies weren't found. They died of disease, they died of hunger, they died of thirst. There were a lot of things killing these men, or that would have killed these men in the actual swamp itself, aside from just crocodiles. But anyways, that's just what I think. If you have a different opinion, or if you know of any other sources that I didn't dig up about this particular incident, I'd really like to hear them in the comments, so please continue the conversation down there. I think incidents like this, where there's some debate or where there's some uncertainty or lack of evidence, these are the perfect things to have a discussion about in a group setting. So let's continue that down there. If you are interested in this kind of content, things related to Japan, things related to the outdoors, history is something I have a passion for, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you have any ideas for future videos, because actually this incident, the Battle of Ramree Island, was a request from viewers. That's why I made this video. So please, I'm open ears. If you have any other requests, please write them down there in the comments. Anyways, thank you everyone, and take care. I will catch you next time.